Hello, my name is Edgardo Diaz. Today I'll be talking about the autism spectrum disorder. Now, just for all intents and purposes, you might hear me reference the autism spectrum disorder as ASD. Please note, I am talking about the same thing, I'm just using the abbreviated form. Now, when it comes to ASD, please know that that in itself is not a diagnosis, but instead is actually an umbrella term that covers multiple different diagnoses that are all interrelated. So hopefully by the end of the series of videos that we're about to go over, we will be able to potentially spot a child that falls into the ASD categories, learn how to properly approach a child that has a form of ASD, as well as just some general information about each of the different diagnoses that we're going to discuss. Here we go. Hey, so right now we're going to talk about Asperger's syndrome, which is one of the five different diagnoses that you can find under ASD. Asperger's is often called high functioning autism. It's also considered the mildest form of autism. So that's where you get the high functioning because the issues that would affect a child in the ASD is not as severe as other different diagnoses. These kids have the possibility of um, growing up and no one really being aware that they had a ASD through good amount of treatment and good therapy and stuff like that. But that we'll discuss that in a moment. As I mentioned earlier, it's considered the high functioning autism, and the two core features of autism in general is social and communication deficit, as well as fixated interests and repeated behaviors. The social communication deficits in high functioning person with autism, also known as Asperger's syndrome, includes the lack of normal back and forth conversation. So it's really hard for the child to go in just a regular conversation, just poor communication skills. It doesn't really flow as if a regular person would have a conversation. It's a little bit different. And when presented with a child with Asperger's, you can really pick up on that when you're having a conversation with them. A lack of typical eye contact. The children will really avoid looking you in the eyes. They'll look around you. They'll look at the floor. They'll look at their hands. They'll look, out the window. They will have really hard time focusing in on the person they're talking to, especially when it comes to eye contact. The body language and facial expression is off, and they have trouble maintaining relationships. Their fixated interests and repetitive behaviors include repetitive use of objects or phrases, stereotyped movements, and excessive attachment to routine objects or interests. So you'll find a child that has Asperger's. Um, they'll kind of give off a vibe of somebody who kind of has an OCD ish, where they would possibly constantly touch their nose in a conversation or fiddle with their hands or their hair. Um, but these are all just signs of possible Asperger's. Now, a person that falls under ASD may also respond to sensory aspects of the environment with unusual interests. I've read an article where children with Asperger's have in some cases, would have a high sensitivity towards smells. So if it has a certain smell, we'll say lavender, if there's a hint of lavender or the teacher's wearing lavender perfume, the child might have trouble concentrating. The prevalence of Asperger's is really not well established. It's not often recognized before the age of 5 or 6, because one of the key indicators is language, and the child's language isn't really fully developed until 5 years, 6 years old, which is kind of interesting because doctors try to diagnose a child that has anything related to ASD by the age of 2. So even though they're trying to get an early diagnosis, it's really hard because some of um, the key warning signs won't develop for another 3 to 4 years. Experts estimate that as many as 1 in 88 children at the age of 8 will have some type of ASD, but yet no studies have been conducted to determine the incident rate of Asperger's syndrome in adult populations. But studies of children with the disorder suggest that their problem with socialization and communication continue into adulthood, and right there, that's where you can start seeing the problem forming and maintaining relationships. Now, some of these children will develop additional psychiatric symptoms, and disorders in that adolescence and adulthood. Now, when it comes to male to female ratios, males are 3 to 4 times more likely than girls to get diagnosed with some type of disorder under ASD. Now, I mentioned earlier, children have with Asperger's, when ASD in general, but specifically in Asperger's, they have poor communication skills and linguistic skills. Well, according to my sources, which is the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Strokes, as well as WebMD, um, children with Asperger's syndrome may have speech marked by a lack of rhythm and odd inflections in monotone pitch. They often lack the ability to modulate the volume of their voice to match their surroundings. For example, if you have a child in church, the child, instead of whispering to the parent or friend some type of information, you might find the child talking at an extremely high pitch, which will become distracting. So they have trouble really talking in correct tones, as well as they might just seem monotone, which would give us, who's not used to hearing that kind of speech patterns, uh, it will give us a clue that something's wrong because we're just not familiar with that kind of speech. Now, when it comes to diagnosing anything in the autism spectrum disorder, it's usually done in a two-stage process. The first stage begins with the developmental screening during what doctors call the well child checkup with the family doctor, pediatrician. And the second stage is when a comprehensive team of experts such as psychologists, neurologists, psychiatrists, speech therapists, and all other professionals that have expertise in diagnosing um, disorders that fall under ASD, especially Asperger's, they come together and they do an evaluation. Now, there is no cure for any of the diagnoses that we find under ASD, but there are effective treatments. And those treatments tend to build off of the child's interests, offers the predictable schedules for the child, so nothing can catch the child off guard. Um, and to help the child get over their barriers, it is extremely helpful to become really engaged in the child's um, life, in the teaching and the molding of the child's mind. Now, I'm just going to give you a little bit of information on what a proper treatment would be. Social skill training is in group therapy settings. that teaches children the skills they need to interact more successfully with other children. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a type of talk therapy um, that can help the more explosive or anxious children, the kids that have high anxiety issues and behavioral issues. This can help manage their emotions better by explaining to them the emotions, by helping them walk through on managing and coping skills. Medication, only if it's necessary though. So it's not like a child would be diagnosed with ASD or Asperger's, as we're talking about in this video clip. But the medication is only in a needed basis. You're not going to get an automatic diagnosis paired with a prescription. But we do find that children that have Asperger's and other ASD disorders, they do have a problem with depression and anxiety. Now, for the more severe forms of ASD, there are occupational physical therapy for children that they have sensory integration problems and poor motor coordination, so they have trouble moving around, overreaction to sounds and stuff like that. One of the key forms of helping out a child that have ASD, especially Asperger's, is speech therapy. And the bedrock of all therapy is having a good support network. So when we see teachers, doctors, and parents working together successfully and really putting forth a good effort, then we see the effects of ASD start to shrink. And in this case, we're going to talk specifically about Asperger's. We start to see it shrink. Now, when it comes to Asperger's in specific, there's a chance that it might be a blessing to the child. Because as I mentioned earlier, they do have a tendency to become obsessive over a specific topic. They will study that one topic, learn all the facts. They will memorize the facts. They can, tell you the most smallest, hard to think of fact about the topic that they choose. Once they kind of hone in on that topic, they can have the chance to become masters of that topic if that topic is embraced in the child's life. There are famous people throughout history who have been diagnosed with Asperger's. Let me get my source here. I know in history they assume, they believe that Albert Einstein had Asperger's. And there's other members throughout history that's interesting to find out who they are that have been positively diagnosed at Asperger's and other ASD related diagnoses. All right, so next we're going to see a video that was created to help teachers teach children with Asperger's and other forms of ASD. All right, thank you, and I'll see you after the clip.
Teaching tips for children with Asperger's. Accentuate your students' strengths. Children with Asperger's may have talents in a number of domains. Be sure to be on the lookout for those strengths and talents, just as you would with any other student. Encourage the child and his parents to expand a child's skill or talent. Be sensitive to your student's deficits. For example, your student may struggle with fine motor or gross motor difficulties. Or your student may be extremely sensitive to noise, sounds, or smells. Try to tailor your approach to teaching that student accordingly. Children with Asperger's benefit from the maximum amount of engagement possible, along with a good amount of structure. Find effective ways to deal with fixations. The best way to deal with fixations is to use them to motivate schoolwork. For example, if the student likes trains, then use trains to teach reading and math. Read a book about a train and do math problems with trains. Keep your instructions concise and simple. You will want to make sure that your student understands each step that you are giving him. You may want to write out the instructions so that the student can read them. Remember that many Asperger's children are visual learners. Utilize your students' specialized interests. One of the key Asperger's characteristics is a tendency to have specialized interests. Rather than trying to shut down or limit that interest, you may be able to harness that interest to teach other concepts.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm here with Maggie, my trusted assistant, and we are eating breakfast together. And Maggie is using her brand new eye gaze computer to tell me about her breakfast. That's a blackberry. What do you think of your blackberries, Maggie?
I like it.
Yeah, you like blackberries very much.
Orange juice.
Okay, you want some orange juice? I can get you some orange juice.
Orange juice.
Look, orange juice. More waffles. And,
Yuck.
oh, you don't want the waffle? More blackberry?
I like it.
Okay, here's another blackberry. And there are all kinds of things that we can talk about and we can share on this new computer, and it's been awesome just to be able to hear your voice and hear what's inside here. It's been really cool. Mm, you know,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
Maggie, we're going to go to school after breakfast, and you're gonna see Miss Risa and Miss Crystal.
Yay.
Yeah, you love school. Can you tell everybody about Maggie?
This is me, my mommy, and my daddy. I am 40 years old.
Why don't we share with everybody some things?
I like riding. I like riding the trains.
Yeah, you like riding trains. What else? Do you like jumping?
I like jumping super high.
Yeah.
Making movies is pretty fun.
I agree. That's right. So, we're able to talk to her now. It's amazing. We're just really appreciative to be able to communicate with her. It's been a big change for us, and it's relieving for her to be able to get her thoughts out, and it's wonderful for us to hear them. And so, as always, donate if you can, subscribe if you can't, and we will see you next week. All right, thanks.
Okay, so now that we've finished watching that video clip, I'm just going to briefly talk over a few of the other diagnoses that can be found under ASD. I'm going to briefly touch on them because there are a lot of similarities. But there's going to be one more that I want to come up and talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment. But before we get to that diagnosis, we're going to talk about pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. Now, this is a diagnosis that will be given when a kid isn't quite at the Asperger's marker, but is not as severe as the autistic disorder marker. So he falls somewhere in the middle, and the child, he or she, their symptoms are more severe than would be found in Asperger's, but not as severe in autistic disorder. So once again, they're found over here. And just reading from my notes here, it says, what you'll find with children with PDD-NOS, once again, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, is impaired social interaction, much like all other diagnoses that are found in ASD. You're going to have better linguistic skills than kids with autistic disorder, but not as good as Asperger's. So once again, they're found in the medium. Fewer repetitive behaviors than children with Asperger's syndrome or autistic disorder. So this is a very interesting point to think about. the kids who have both either Asperger or autism, the two different sides of the spectrum right now that we're taking into consideration, the child will have less repetitive behaviors than those. So, it would be a little bit harder to use repetitive behavior as a marker when trying to think about possible PDD-NOS, because it's not as severe as we see in the other two disorders, and the Asperger's syndrome and autistic disorder that we're going to be discussing. Also, PDD-NOS is found later on in age, so it's not as early as per se Asperger's or autistic disorder. It's a little bit later on, but at the same time, that can be a little bit beneficial when it comes to diagnosing, because as the kid gets older, their language skills are supposed to follow a certain track. But if it's not following along those tracks, then it gives you some type of idea that there's something wrong that needs to be investigated. And here is a very big detail. Whenever you hear that you might have a student that have PDD NOS, you cannot paint them with a broad paintbrush. You cannot say what worked for Jimmy is going to work for Kimmy. You can't say what worked for Mike is going to work for Sue. They're all different. They're all unique. And each and every child who has PDD NOS, the severity of their symptoms range. They're on a scale, but Jimmy's repetitive behavior might be more severe than Kimmy's, but his linguistic skills are better than hers. Or it could be something along those lines. So you really have to fine tune the treatment and the behavior you're going to show towards the kid to help them learn towards the individual. And once again, we spoke about how to go about teaching and treating these kids in the earlier video clip. Now I'm going to talk about autistic disorder. Children who have met the rigid criteria for to be diagnosed with autism will be considered to have autistic disorder. Their impairments, I don't really want to say the word handicap, but no better word is coming to mind right now, but their handicaps is much more severe. If you compare that to Asperger's, fine motor skills, they essentially can be treated as any other child, just with a little bit of fine tuning on how to go about teaching them. But autistic kids, you really have to cater to their disability. You really have to cater to their disorder, because it is important that you work with them because their condition is, once again, so much more severe. So you really have to keep in mind and focus on the kids with autistic disorder. We often find that kids who have autism also have mental retardation, as well as suffer from many, many, many seizures throughout their lifetime. And once again, because of that mental retardation, that's where we see the severity of their disorders, like the motor skills, their sensory motor reaction to sounds and smells is so much more severe, because we often see that autism being coupled with mental retardation. Now, the next condition that we're going to talk about is Rett syndrome, and this is the one that I want to talk about a little bit in detail. Rett syndrome rarely affects males. We usually find it in females. But we praise God that Rett syndrome is rare. It says that about 1 in every 10,000 to 15,000 girls develop the Rett syndrome, which is a really severe form of autism. Once again, that's inside that ASD. Rett syndrome can be found between the ages of 6 and 18 months. The child stops responding socially, starts to, um, mess with her hands as I'm doing, fiddle with her hands, and loses complete language skills. Coordination problems become apparent. They while they still can walk because they can lose their ability to walk totally. You'll see that they bump into walls often, that they fall for no reason, that standing still they start to fall backwards and end up running backwards. Um, Also, sadly to say, that their head growth starts to slow down, and by the time the child is of 2 years of age, their head is significantly smaller than what it should be. They have found that Rett syndrome has a correlation with some genetic mutations. When it comes to treatment for Rett syndrome, there's a huge focus on physical therapy and speech therapy to improve function if the child has not lost those abilities yet. Now, we're going to see in a video clip that I'm going to have associated with my video clip, of a young girl, I believe her name is Maggie, using something called the eye gaze computer. Maggie, heartbreakingly so, she had lost her ability to communicate, to talk. And you'll see that she's eating breakfast with her dad, and for the first time, her dad hears her voice again, because this eye gaze computer tracks her eye movement to specific words that are on the computer screen and then says the words. So essentially, a kid who has a severe form of Rett syndrome can communicate with the use of computers and other software that exists. Once again, she used an eye gaze computer. Now, doctors have broken up Rett syndrome into about 4 stages. And just briefly, the first stage is considered early onset. That's between the ages of 6 and 8 months, as I mentioned earlier, where you'll start, if you pay close attention, to see a slowing down of development. But it's really hard because the child is so young. Unless you're an expert in the field, it's really hard to see what the proper rate of development is. Now, stage two, which is between the 1 and 4 years old, is considered the rapid destructive stage. That's where the child starts to lose its motor skills, it starts to lose its linguistic skills, and everything starts to go downhill fast. Once again, that's between the ages of 1 and 4. Stage three is considered the plateau stage. Um, that is between the ages of 2 and 10, and that varies because it also depends on how severe was stage 2. So between the ages of 2 and 10, things kind of stabilize for a little bit. Things will drop in stage 2 and then stop, and the plateau stage was kind of just keep it there for the time being, and that can last for years. Stage 4 is considered the late motor deterioration stage, and that's where loss of mobility occurs, bone deformation comes. The child can develop scoliosis, other type of diseases that involve bone structure. When it comes to interacting with kids like this, you have to really first have patience. I personally don't think that a child who has Rett syndrome will go to just any school. It would have to be a specialized school or homeschooling. But you have to have patience, because without special tools, the child might not be able to communicate with you. The child fidgets. It moves. He or she, most of the time, she would fidget, move her hands a lot, and I mean, it's a really heartbreaking condition. So my best advice when it comes to dealing with a child with this disorder, would be just patience. We're going to stop now, and then we're going to go ahead and watch the video of Maggie. And I will also link in the PowerPoint another video that briefly describes, maybe better than I have, exactly what Rett is. Welcome back. The final diagnosis that can be found under ASD is childhood disintegrative disorder, and it is the most severe form of autism. It is the most severe diagnosis in ASD. Once again, the autism spectrum disorder. But once again, you got to praise God because CDD, child disintegrative disorder, is the least diagnosed. It is the least common. It is even more rare than Rett's, and once again, that affects one female in every 10 to 15,000. After a short period of development, usually between 2 and 4 years, of the child's life, so this happens very early. A child with CDD would rapidly, almost, I can't even explain how fast it would happen, but would rapidly start to lose functionality in all areas. Social and language skills are lost. Intellectual abilities are lost. Motor skills are lost. And just thinking, as a parent, I am a father, I have a 3-year-old son. Just doing a little bit of research I've seen where the reports were my child, my son, my daughter was fine not that long ago, a few months ago. They're not the same. And then next thing they know, the parent knows their child is being diagnosed with CDD and can no longer do anything for themselves. Not only does the child suffer great losses in multiple areas of function, they lose. They start to have many seizures at a time. They develop a seizure disorder, and sadly to say, those functions that were lost won't be regained. The rate that you can find CDD is about fewer. Statistics say fewer than 2 out of 100,000 kids with ASD would ever meet the criteria for childhood disintegrative disorder. Boys have a higher rate of getting CDD than females. But once again, this is the most severe form of autism. I wouldn't wish this upon anyone. Once again, speaking as a parent, I can only imagine it's challenging. I try to do some research on how to approach children with this disorder and how to teach them, and I really couldn't find much. So if you are involved in a child who has CDD, much like the advice I gave for Rett's disorder, is patience. Patience and, most importantly, compassion. It's not the child's fault that they have this disorder. It's nothing that they did. And while I don't think any of us would blame the child, we have to have that patience and a lot of love to show that child that we're there. Because I think if it gets to this point where the child has pretty much, metaphorically overnight lost all of their functionality, because once again it can be so severe that they actually can no longer hold their bladders and their bowels, so they can, there's a possibility that they can go on themselves. I think more importantly that they receive us, that they see us loving them and loving on them than anything else. All right, everyone. Once again, my name is Edgardo Diaz. Studying psychology, looking to be a clinical psychologist. So that's why I took more of a clinical psychologist approach to this project, and I just hope it was informative. Hope I was able to help you guys and everybody. God bless. Have a great day.